From the outside, my life looked curated by someone who understood light. The townhouse on Hawthorne Crescent caught the morning sun through tall glass windows, warming the marble foyer in a way that made everything appear intentional, as though the house itself had been designed not merely for living, but for being admired. The bookshelves were arranged by color and subject. The art on the walls had been chosen by my own eye, not a decorator's recommendation. Fresh flowers sat on the console table every Monday morning because I believed that small, deliberate acts of beauty said something important about the kind of woman you chose to be. Daniel liked to say we lived inside architecture that respected us. I think what he meant was that the house reflected our ambition, our taste, our shared understanding of what a life well constructed looked like from the outside. He was not wrong. But I understand now what he never admitted. He was always performing for an audience, and I was simply the most convenient stage. I ran a contemporary art gallery downtown. Selective. Refined. Quietly profitable in the way that things built on genuine expertise tend to be. I knew my collectors personally. I knew what moved them, what challenged them, what they would buy before they knew it themselves. My reputation had taken a decade to build and had never once required me to compromise it. Daniel was a financial strategist. Polished and persuasive, with a talent for controlled influence that I had once found deeply attractive. He moved through rooms the way water moves, finding the path of least resistance, shaping itself around whatever obstacles appeared. We hosted dinners that ended with whispered admiration and the quiet exchange of business cards. Crystal glasses. Soft jazz. The kind of evenings where everyone left slightly more impressed than when they arrived, and slightly unsure why. Clara was always there. My younger sister. Soft-spoken and wide-eyed, with a beauty that invited protection and a gentleness that made people feel immediately at ease in her presence. She had always existed, in some quiet way, in my shadow, and I had never once thought to wonder whether she resented it. People told me constantly how lucky I was. A successful marriage. A flourishing business. A close family. Stability in all the places that matter. I used to believe them completely. My name is Vivienne Laurent, and I have always believed that composure is a form of power. Not passivity. Not silence for its own sake. Composure, the deliberate, practiced ability to feel everything at full intensity and show only what you choose to show. It is something I learned early, refined over years, and eventually came to wear as naturally as my own skin. People who met me in professional settings often described me as formidable. People who knew me personally described me as warm. Both were true. Neither was the whole picture. My life ran on structure. Mornings at the gallery reviewing acquisitions and correspondence before the staff arrived. Afternoons navigating placements with collectors who trusted my eye over market trends and auction house recommendations. Evenings reserved for Daniel. Shared wine, shared conversation, shared finances that I assumed were as transparent as everything else between us. Our investments were carefully diversified. Our accounts are balanced. Our future mapped in quiet, mutual confidence. I had never been a woman who doubted without reason. Clara had begun coming over more often in the months before everything changed. She said her apartment felt empty. She said she was going through a period of transition, reassessing her direction, needing the steadiness that being near me always provided. Daniel always insisted she stay for dinner. He would open an extra bottle of wine and settle into his chair with the particular ease of a man entirely comfortable in his surroundings. I found it generous. I found it kind. The first fracture was almost invisible, barely a crack, the kind that appears in a wall long before the structure becomes unstable. A glance between them that lingered a half-second longer than it should have. A silence that fell while I was speaking, as though my words had briefly ceased to matter. A vibration from Daniel's phone that he turned face down before I could see the screen, his hand moving with a casualness that was just slightly too deliberate. "It's nothing," he said when I raised an eyebrow. "But nothing does not feel like that. Nothing does not carry weight." I filed the moment away without examining it, the way you file something you are not yet ready to name. I questioned myself long before I questioned either of them. That is the particular cruelty of loving people you trust completely. Suspicion, when it first arrives, turns inward. I began to wonder whether I was becoming someone who invented problems to justify distance. Whether the pressures of the gallery were making me hypersensitive. Whether the ease I had noticed between Daniel and Clara was simply the natural comfort of two people who had spent years in proximity to each other through me. Clara had always leaned on me, admired my discipline, looked to my marriage as a model of what she wanted to build someday. Perhaps, I reasoned, Daniel's protectiveness toward her was nothing more than the extension of a kindness he had learned from watching me. Perhaps I was projecting something unworthy onto something entirely innocent. I tried to believe that. But small shifts continued to accumulate in the way that small things do, quietly, without announcement, each one easy to explain away individually until suddenly there are too many of them to dismiss. Clara began touching his arm when she laughed, a gesture so brief and natural that I might have missed it every time if I hadn't already been watching. Daniel began finishing her sentences. He began defending her before I had finished raising a concern, cutting me off mid-thought with a gentleness that somehow felt like a door closing. "You're too hard on her," he would say. That phrase landed differently each time. By the fourth or fifth occurrence, it had stopped feeling like advocacy and begun feeling like instruction. Like a gentle, consistent campaign to make me doubt my own perception. I began wondering, seriously and uncomfortably, whether I was becoming unkind. Whether the clarity I prided myself on had curdled into something harsher without my noticing. That thought unsettled me more deeply than any suspicion could have. Because it meant they were already inside my head, already rearranging the furniture of how I understood myself. I was not searching for proof when it found me. I want to be precise about that because it matters. I had not gone looking. I had not installed monitoring software or hired anyone or gone through his pockets in the night. I had, in fact, made a decision the week prior to extend Daniel the benefit of every doubt I possessed and wait to see whether time would dissolve my unease or confirm it. It confirmed it. Daniel left his laptop open on the desk in the study one afternoon. He had stepped outside to take a call. I could see him through the window, pacing slowly along the garden path. I walked past the desk. The screen had not yet dimmed. A message preview sat at the top, visible and fully formed, bearing a name I recognized before I had consciously registered what I was reading. Clara. I clicked before my better judgment could intervene. What unfolded across the screen in the next several minutes was not a moment of discovery so much as a slow, systematic dismantling. Months of messages. Intimacy that left nothing to interpretation. Plans discussed with the easy familiarity of two people who had long since stopped pretending they weren't making them. Complaints about me, about how distant I had become, how absorbed in the gallery, how obsessed with appearances and control. They had given my flaws names. They had rehearsed them. Then I found the deeper cruelty, the kind that sits beneath ordinary betrayal and transforms it into something architectural. Clara had been telling people I was emotionally unstable, that I was unraveling slowly, privately, in ways I could not see myself. That Daniel was exhausted from managing me, from holding our life together while I drifted somewhere unreachable. She had been saying these things to mutual friends, to people whose opinions would matter when the time came. They were not simply having an affair. They were preparing my replacement. And they were preemptively discrediting me so that when I eventually discovered the truth, no one would quite believe my version of it. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that because people always expect tears to be the first response, as though grief cannot exist without the physical evidence of it. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice, or pick up the phone, or walk out into the garden and confront Daniel where he stood, still pacing, still on his call, utterly unaware that the architecture of his deception had just collapsed through a single open laptop screen. I sat in Daniel's chair, his chair, specifically, with the particular deliberateness of someone who understands the symbolism of space, and I read everything twice. My heartbeat remained steady throughout. My breathing is controlled. I have thought about that since, and I believe it was not the absence of feeling but rather the presence of something colder and more useful. The automatic, professional composure that takes over when the emotional body is too overwhelmed to function and the rational mind simply steps forward and begins to work. My sister had not only betrayed me, she was rewriting me. She was constructing a version of Vivienne Laurent that was fragile and unstable and in decline. And she was distributing that version to people who trusted her, so that by the time the real story surfaced, I would already have been discredited in advance. When Daniel returned from the garden, I closed the laptop and walked to the kitchen. I kissed his cheek. I asked about his call. I poured him a glass of wine and listened to his answer with the patient, interested expression of a woman who had no idea that anything was wrong. He smiled and reached for the glass. Silence, I realized then, was not weakness. It was the most precise weapon I owned. And I had just decided to use it. Chapter 6. Silence is strategy. Noise would have united them against me. If I had confronted Daniel that evening, if I had raised my voice or wept or demanded explanations, they would have had immediate warning. They would have closed ranks. The messages would have disappeared. Accounts would have shifted. The narrative Clara had been quietly constructing about my instability would have received its most compelling evidence yet. Vivienne, finally unraveling exactly the way we always said she would. I understood this with a clarity that surprised even me. Because in the moment of discovering the worst thing that had ever happened to my life, some clear-eyed, operational part of me was already thinking 3 steps ahead. So I gave them silence instead. And silence, I discovered, is far more disorienting to guilty people than accusation. I began observing with the precision I normally reserved for gallery acquisitions, evaluating everything, revealing nothing. I watched the eye contact between Daniel and Clara when she came for dinner, which she continued to do, twice the following week. I noted the slight adjustment in Clara's voice when she spoke to me directly, the particular sweetness that coated every sentence, the careful questions, the studied concern. I watched Daniel's phone habits, his schedule, the rhythm of his attention. They were comfortable, dangerously comfortable. They mistook my composure for ignorance. People always do. It is, I have found, the most reliable feature of those who believe they are clever. They cannot imagine that someone else might be more patient than they are. They assumed that my silence meant I had seen nothing, that my warmth meant I suspected nothing, that I was exactly where they needed me to be. That miscalculation would become the foundation of everything that followed. I copied everything. Not in a panic. Not recklessly. I returned to the laptop the following day when Daniel was at a client meeting that I knew from his calendar would last no less than 2 hours. And I worked with the methodical efficiency of someone who understands that documentation is the difference between justice and a story no one can prove. Messages. Every thread, every date, every exchange. Photographs. Timestamps. The particular language they used when discussing me. Useful evidence of premeditation, of coordinated intent, of a campaign that had been running far longer than I had imagined. Then I went further, because I am not a woman who stops at the obvious layer. Daniel had been transferring money into Clara's account. I found the records in the shared financial portal I had always had access to but rarely scrutinized because I had believed, naively, I now understood, that trust was a reasonable substitute for oversight. The transfers were labeled consulting support. Thousands of dollars, moved quietly over the span of months, drawn from assets we held jointly. Hotel charges disguised as client dinners. Travel expenses routed through his business account for trips I had not known he was taking. A weekend in a coastal city during a period when I believed he was at a conference I had never thought to verify. I built timelines. I cross-referenced dates. I assembled the financial record alongside the personal one until I had something that was no longer a wound. It was a case file. The betrayal was emotional, but it was also financial. And that meant it had consequences that extended well beyond the personal. That meant I had leverage. And leverage, I had always understood, is simply preparation with patience attached to it. At a gallery fundraiser, a collector I had known for 7 years touched my arm during the champagne hour and asked, very gently, if I was doing all right. I smiled with the particular warmth I had spent years perfecting and asked what she meant. She hesitated, that specific hesitation of someone who has said more than they intended and is now calculating how to retreat gracefully. Just, someone mentioned you'd been going through a difficult period. That things at home had been stressful. I held her gaze and kept my expression soft and unbothered. I appreciate you asking, I said. Things are absolutely fine. But there it was. Confirmed, in that brief and revealing exchange, the shape of what Clara had been doing in the weeks and months prior. Planting seeds. Not dramatic accusations. Nothing that could be directly attributed or refuted. Just quiet, compassionate concern. Vivienne has seemed off lately. Vivienne has been struggling more than she lets on. Isn't it difficult? How much pressure she puts on herself. One worries. Soft words. Gentle inflections. The kind of thing that slips into a listener's mind and changes the color of everything they see afterward. She was not destroying my reputation with a single blow. She was eroding it gradually, the way water erodes stone, without violence, without urgency, with only the patient consistency of someone who intends to be there long after the original surface has worn away. I understood then the full scope of what she had designed. She was not preparing to take my husband. She was preparing to take my life, my standing, my credibility, my identity, and step into the space I left behind. I decided, in that moment, to let her finish building the whole. I would not be the one standing in it when she was done. There is a family law and financial litigation attorney in this city whose reputation is known in every circle that matters and discussed in none of them. She operates with a discretion so absolute that her clients' names never surface in casual conversation. She was recommended to me by a collector who passed along the contact without elaborating, which told me everything I needed to know about the nature of the referral. I called on a Tuesday morning. I used a phone I had purchased separately, for cash, the previous week. I sat across from her in a room with no windows facing the street, and I placed a folder on the table between us. Inside the folder was what I had spent the previous 2 weeks assembling, organized, dated, cross-referenced with the quiet precision of someone who had always understood that the way you present information determines what people believe about it. She reviewed it without speaking. The only sound in the room was the occasional turn of a page. When she looked up, her expression was composed in the way that skilled professionals' expressions are composed, revealing nothing except credibility. "You have leverage," she said. That word. Leverage. I repeated it inwardly. It felt cleaner than revenge, more exact than justice. Leverage was not emotional. Leverage was structural. It meant that I had the ability to determine what happened next, and that what happened next would not be determined by Daniel's confidence or Clara's carefully constructed narrative but by my own timeline. I did not cry in her office. I left with a plan, a retainer agreement, and the settled certainty of a woman who is no longer reacting, but building. Daniel had underestimated 2 things about me. The first was my memory. I retain financial detail with the same precision that some people retain music or language, not as a learned skill but as a native capacity. Figures I had seen once, months or years prior, remained available to me with a clarity that had proved professionally invaluable and was now, in the most personal context of my life, about to become devastating to the man who had assumed my trust was a form of inattention. The second thing Daniel had underestimated was our prenuptial agreement. I had reviewed the terms carefully years ago and had never allowed myself to forget them. The agreement contained a clause, standard in structure, precise in application, that addressed marital misconduct and its consequences for asset division. Infidelity, defined without ambiguity, altered the financial terms significantly. In his favor without it. Against him with it. He had known about the clause. He had signed above it with the easy confidence of a man who could not imagine it ever applying to him. The financial transfers I had documented told a parallel legal story, hidden movement of marital assets, structured deliberately to obscure their destination, routed through channels designed to evade our joint account visibility. This was not merely the emotional betrayal of a husband who had cheated. This was financial misconduct with a paper trail long enough to follow to its conclusion. He thought he had been clever. He forgot that I read contracts for pleasure, and that I had been reading his, quietly and completely, for the past 3 weeks. As I continued to map the timeline, I began to understand that what I was looking at was not something that had developed impulsively. Affairs born of impulse have a particular texture, erratic, fragmented, driven by feeling rather than logistics. What I found in the records and the messages told a different story entirely. This had not begun months ago. It had begun more than a year before I found the open laptop. I traced it backward through receipts, through hotel bookings made under alternate contact details, through message threads that had started in one register and shifted so gradually that I could chart the exact week the language changed. I found the point at which Clara had begun visiting more frequently. I identified the specific dinner at which I had noticed, and dismissed, the first lingering glance between them. They had been patient. Extraordinarily patient. Not because their feeling for each other was deep or considered, I do not believe it was, but because patience was required to manage me, to keep me composed and unsuspecting while they built the infrastructure of their plan, the financial transfers, the social narrative, the gradual positioning of themselves as sympathetic figures and me as a woman already beginning to unravel. They had studied me the way one studies a system one intends to dismantle. They had identified my trust as the entry point and my competence as the blind spot. They had not been wrong about that. But they had made a single, fatal miscalculation. They assumed that once they had finished their preparations, they would move faster than I could respond. I would still be more patient. There is a specific moment in any process of grief or betrayal where something fundamental changes inside a person. It is not the moment of discovery. Discovery is shocking. It is white and cold and it moves through you like a current. The moment I am describing comes days or weeks later, quieter and less dramatic, when the heart stops expecting a different outcome and the mind accepts the reality it has been offered and decides, with full awareness, what to do with it. That moment arrived for me on a Saturday morning. I was standing at the gallery window before anyone else had arrived, holding a cup of coffee I had not yet drunk, looking at the street below. And I felt something shift, not break, not collapse, but shift, the way tectonic plates shift, silently, beneath the surface, with consequences that would not become visible for some time. Hurt sharpened into clarity. This was no longer, I understood, a matter of heartbreak. Heartbreak is personal. Heartbreak is about loss and grief and the specific ache of loving someone who did not love you the way you believed. That was present, I will not pretend otherwise, but it had receded behind something more useful and more precise. This was now about control. The control of assets, of reputation, of narrative. The question of whose version of events would ultimately become the one that was believed. The question of who would define Vivienne Laurent, me, or the people who had spent the better part of a year building a version of me designed to fail. They believed they were orchestrating my humiliation. They had forgotten who understood strategy best. I began quietly, and I began with the gallery. My attorney had advised me on the sequence. Before any formal legal proceedings, before any confrontation, before anything that might alert Daniel to the nature of what was coming, I needed to establish financial independence with the same surgical care he had used to build his hidden arrangements, except that everything I did would be entirely legal, entirely documentable, and entirely impossible to challenge. I restructured Laurent Gallery under separate holding company. The process was legitimate and properly filed, a business reorganization of a kind that occurs routinely in the industry and required no explanation to anyone, including Daniel, who had never been formally involved in the gallery's operations and had no stake in its structure. The change rerouted revenue streams and ownership documentation in ways that clarified and protected my professional assets against any future dispute. I redirected shared investments that fell within my legal entitlement under our prenuptial terms. I separated access privileges on accounts I had every right to access independently. Daniel signed several documents during this period, routine administrative items that arrived among the ordinary paperwork of our shared financial life. He signed without reading them carefully. He had always done this. He trusted me with the financial architecture of our life because, he believed, I trusted him completely and had no reason to be careful. Trust makes people careless. I had learned this, in the most personal way possible, at his expense. I expanded the gallery's portfolio with a focus and energy that my staff noticed and commented on with visible admiration. 2 new artists added to the represented roster, both of whom I had been considering for months and now moved decisively to sign. A partnership with a European collector group that had been in discussion for over a year and that I closed in a single, well-prepared meeting. A series of evening events, curated, invitation only, precisely the kind of visibility that builds the specific type of reputation that survives personal turbulence intact. I was not hiding. I was expanding. I was making sure that by the time the rest of my life changed, the thing I had built with my own hands would be standing so firmly that nothing could move it. I secured independent credit under my professional entity, not because I expected to need it immediately, but because access to financial independence should never depend on the continued goodwill of someone who has already demonstrated they do not wish you well. And through all of it, Clara continued visiting. She would arrive on Thursday evenings with a bottle of wine and that practiced warmth, settling into the kitchen while I cooked, talking about her life with the easy intimacy of a woman who believed the relationship between us was still what it had always appeared to be. She touched things in my home with the comfortable familiarity of someone already in some interior version of the future, imagining herself in it. She smiled at me with her whole face. I smiled back with exactly as much as was required. We were both performing. Only one of us knew it. Daniel grew bold in the way that people grow bold when they believe they have already won. It is a particular kind of carelessness that sets in when the outcome feels decided, when the plan has progressed far enough that caution begins to feel unnecessary. He stopped explaining his schedule in the careful, preemptive way he had maintained for months. Occasional overnight business trips that had once been accompanied by detailed itineraries and frequent texts now came with little more than a day's notice and a brevity that suggested he had stopped believing he needed to convince me of anything. Clara no longer performed the discomfort of divided loyalties. She had been careful, in the early period of what they were doing, to maintain a studied formality around Daniel in my presence, a slight distance that I now understood had been entirely theatrical. That performance had quietly ended. She touched his shoulder when she passed him. She laughed at things he said before he finished saying them. She referenced shared experiences I had not been part of with a naturalness that could only come from months of accumulated familiarity. They were preparing for a seamless transition. They had decided, between themselves, that the moment was approaching, that the narrative Clara had built was sufficiently established, that I was sufficiently positioned in the minds of people who mattered as a woman whose marriage had deteriorated under the weight of her own complexity. They believed the transition would be seamless. They believed I was weak. They had spent so long watching a performance of composure that they had mistaken the performance for the person underneath it. What a costly error that would prove to be. I played my role with the complete investment of someone who understands that a performance must be entirely believed to be useful. I was an attentive wife. Present at dinners. Interested in Daniel's projects with the particular warmth of a woman who still believed in the shared future being discussed. I asked him about his clients. I listened to his answers. I initiated quiet evenings at home that gave him absolutely no reason to believe anything between us had changed in the weeks since I had read everything on his laptop. I was a devoted sister. I called Clara on her birthday, as I always had, and brought her flowers, white peonies, because she had always loved them. I asked about her life with the genuine seeming interest of someone who still believed in the relationship's integrity. I thanked her, warmly and directly, for being so present during what I described, with careful vagueness, as a demanding season in my professional life. You're always there for me, I told her. I don't know what I'd do without you. I watched her absorb this. The guilt moved across her face, just briefly, just beneath the surface, like something passing under still water. A flicker in her eyes before the practiced warmth reasserted itself and the smile arrived, a half-second too late to be entirely spontaneous. She recovered quickly. She was, I will give her this, genuinely skilled at the performance she had chosen. But I had spent years studying the gap between what faces show and what people feel. I had seen it. And seeing it told me something important. She was not a woman without conscience. She was a woman who had decided to proceed despite having one. That distinction mattered. It would not save her. But it clarified, with precision, exactly what I was dealing with. Daniel's access to certain accounts vanished on a Tuesday morning. The removal was processed through legitimate administrative channels, authorized by documentation that had been filed correctly and in proper sequence, with every step occurring in exactly the order my attorney had specified over the preceding weeks. From Daniel's perspective, it would have appeared as an error, the kind of access disruption that occasionally occurs in complex financial systems and typically resolves itself within 48 hours if someone makes the right calls. He made the right calls. The resolution he expected did not come. He raised it with me over dinner that evening with the casualness of someone who had not yet identified it as significant. A mild administrative irritation, nothing more. I made a sympathetic face. I told him I would look into it. I did not look into it. Clara's rent transfer from his secondary account failed the following week. I watched this from a careful distance with the composed attention of someone monitoring a controlled experiment. She would have called him. I knew this from the pattern of his behavior that evening, the clipped phone exchange, the brief retreat to the study with the door not quite fully closed. She would have been concerned. He would have been reassuring. They would both have arrived at the conclusion that these were unrelated inconveniences and not yet identified the thread connecting them. They were not unrelated. They were sequential. They were the first carefully placed dominoes in a sequence designed to reveal itself slowly enough that the people experiencing it would not understand what they were watching until it was far too late to reverse course. Pressure introduces truth. I had always known this professionally. I was finding it equally reliable in personal application. They began to argue. I did not hear all of it. I was not attempting to surveil their private communications, and I did not need to. What I observed was sufficient. The specific quality of Daniel's tension when he returned from certain calls, the shift in Clara's demeanor on the evenings she still came for dinner, the absence of the easy warmth between them that had replaced, over many months, the careful distance they once maintained for my benefit. Affairs thrive in fantasy. They are sustained by the cleanness of a relationship that exists outside ordinary life, outside financial pressure, outside the grinding logistics of shared existence, outside all the unglamorous friction that reality introduces the moment two people stop meeting only in hotels and beautiful restaurants and begin dealing with the actual texture of a life they are attempting to construct together. Reality is expensive. I understood this, and I had understood it from the beginning of what I was doing. Their relationship had been constructed on a foundation of excitement, shared secrecy, and the particular bond of two people aligned against a common obstacle. I was removing the obstacle, slowly and deliberately, and what remained between them without that alignment was becoming visible in their faces and their voices and the new brittleness of the ease they had always displayed around each other. They were discovering each other in ordinary circumstances. And ordinary circumstances are where the truth about compatibility lives. Not in hotel rooms or in the thrilling logistics of deception, but in the ordinary Tuesday evenings when the excitement has faded and only the actual people remain. The fantasy was becoming expensive. I tightened my hold on the sequence. And I waited. I invited them both to dinner. It was a Wednesday. I chose Wednesday because it sits in the middle of the week, not close enough to the weekend to feel celebratory, not close enough to Monday to feel urgent. An ordinary evening. Nothing about the invitation, which I extended to each of them separately and with the easy warmth that had become my signature during this entire period, signaled anything other than a pleasant shared meal. I cooked. I set the table properly, the good dishes, the linen napkins, candles in the low holders that spread a warm and flattering light across everything. I opened wine and placed the glasses where they would catch the glow. I dressed simply, in the way of a woman entirely at ease in her own home. When they were both seated and the first course had been cleared and the wine had been poured a second time, I set down my own glass. I reached beside my chair to the folder I had placed there before they arrived. I put the printed pages on the table between us. Dates, messages, transactions, receipts. Everything was organized and arranged with the patience of someone who had been preparing it for weeks. I know, I said. I said it quietly. No tremor. No theatrics. I held each of their eyes in turn and gave them the full steadiness of a woman who has known for a very long time and has chosen, with great care, her moment. Daniel's confidence left his face so completely and so quickly it was almost startling, like a projection that had been switched off mid-frame. Clara's composure shattered in a way that, under other circumstances, might have been almost beautiful. The silence that followed did the rest of the work. There was nothing either of them could say that the documents had not already said with far more authority than any words would carry. I filed for divorce the following morning. My attorney had been ready for 2 weeks. The filing was comprehensive, structured, and strategically sequenced. The infidelity clause activated with precision, the financial misconduct documented and attached, the asset restructuring I had completed over the preceding months already legally established and protected from any challenge. The terms that had once favored Daniel under our prenuptial agreement now moved decisively against him. The clause he had signed above and never expected to face now defined every financial conversation that would follow. His attorneys, I was told later, were surprised by the scope and preparation of what they were presented with. They had expected a hurt wife with limited documentation and significant emotional volatility. They received something else entirely. The narrative Clara had spent months constructing. The story of an emotionally unstable Vivienne quietly unraveling while her patient husband managed the deterioration, resurfaced in those early days, as I had expected it would. But it surfaced differently now. Because the documentation I had filed, and the clear-eyed precision with which I had conducted every step of the preceding months, told a different story about the woman who had assembled it. Fragile women do not build case files. They do not execute complex financial reorganizations without detection. They do not sit across from their unfaithful husbands every evening for 2 months, warm and composed and entirely unreadable, while quietly dismantling the ground beneath his feet. Evidence does not ask for a character witness. It simply speaks. Daniel blamed Clara. It happened faster than I had anticipated, though in retrospect it should not have surprised me at all. I had understood from the beginning that what held them together was the shared project of managing me. The moment that project was replaced by the shared experience of consequence, the foundation of what they had built became visible for exactly what it had always been. Not love, not commitment, not even genuine partnership, but mutual utility dressed in the language of feeling. I decided. They mistake restraint for softness. They look at the composed woman who never raised her voice, who continued hosting and working and smiling through the worst months of her personal life, and they read it as tranquility, as a natural state, as something that simply happened to me rather than something I chose, repeatedly and deliberately, under conditions that would have broken a less intentional person entirely. Betrayal did not break me. That is the truest and most important thing I can say about what happened. It refined me in the specific way that prolonged pressure refines certain things, by removing what does not belong, by clarifying exactly what remains. I know myself now in a way I did not before, because I have seen what I do when tested against something real. I do not react. I assess. I plan. I protect. I execute. I do not allow the narrative of my life to be written by people who wish me diminished. Because the most devastating response to those who expect you to fall apart is not noise, is not confrontation, is not the dramatic performance of strength. It is composure. And I never once lost mine.